and my name is Brian Smith. The title there says Ake Chen is going to be joining myself and Adrian, but Ake won't be with us today, but he'll certainly be doing some of the Microsoft Virtual Academy sessions that we'll be putting together over the next few months. Introduction, I think Heather's done most of the sort of the welcome to the webcast type stuff, so I'll introduce the session. We're going to be giving an overview of recent and upcoming changes to Project Online, as well as a review of some of the recent fixes in Project Server 2013 Cumulative Updates. Now, I appreciate this is a little bit of a mixture, and some of you will just be online, and some of you will just be Project Server 2013 on-premises. But I know a lot of our partners and support people join these calls, so it is quite useful, I think, to sort of present both sides of it and gives a little bit of information that may not be directly relevant to you, but will be useful information to what's going on the other side, be that online or on premises. Who are we? I'll hand over to Adrian Jenkins to do an introduction at this point.
Well, thank you, Brian. My name's Adrian, and as this introduction says, we've all three, even though Ake is not here, we've been working with Project Server for the longest time that you can imagine. I myself have been working with Project since the beginning of Project 1.0. We handle all of the high-level escalations that come from customers and you regarding problems that you may be running into and so forth. We also work directly with the product group on future directions and just trying to figure out what are the areas that we really need to focus on heavily. So if we see certain things that we sense are going to become an issue, we will work directly with the product team to get fixes online and so forth.
Okay, thanks, Adrian. I've not been working with Project quite so long. I think my first touches were sort of at 4.0 and certainly beyond that.
That's long enough.
That's long enough. It's long enough. Okay, so the agenda for today, I'm going to be doing the initial part for Project Online, so talking about some of the recent changes and upcoming changes to that, so some version control information, user site sync settings that we've got some changes coming, and then a couple of announcements that we've made very recently about the Business Intelligence Center going away, and also some changes in My Tasks and Outlook Syncs. That's a notice of deprecation of those particular features. So without further ado, on to the Project Online changes. The first one, I blogged about this a little while ago. It's been out there for a little while, but just thought I'd mention it in this webcast just in case you haven't come across it. We've added into Project Online a feature that has been in Project Server 2010 and Project Server 2013 for a reasonable amount of time. And that's to be able to control the connecting version of Project Client, be that Project Pro for Office 365 or Project Professional 2013. So within Project Online, you can now go in and put in that you only want to allow a version such as 15.0.4615.1000 to be connected to your Project Online. And a reason for putting that particular version in could be something like we fix something in the August CU on Project Professional, and that's the version number, and that will make sure that nobody with an older client can connect to Project Online and reintroduce that specific issue. So it's a great way of really protecting yourself from things that we know we fixed, and just make sure they don't come back again. The next set of changes, some of these have already happened. I know some of you have seen some of these. Some haven't happened yet, but these will be happening over the next sort of few sort of weeks or months. But what we're doing is we're introducing the ability to give you more control over the creation of sites for projects, but also the synchronization of permissions to those sites as well. So you will be able to choose in Project Online if you're going to create sites at all. We've certainly heard a lot of feedback from customers that they don't always want sites. Some customers never want sites. Others want sites, but just for a few of their projects. But the way that Project Online was working, you always had the project site, regardless. The other thing we found, as well as the feedback from our customers, partners, and MVPs, that this wasn't necessarily desirable to always have a site, we were finding that some of the background work that goes on, both in creating the sites and doing all the synchronization, was pretty heavy on resources as well. So put those two things together, and it seemed, well, we're spending quite a bit of time and effort doing things that not everybody seems to want. So what we did was decided to make some changes there. The one that you may already have seen is the one that's just come up in the screenshot, and you can now choose whether you enable Project Web App Sync or Project Site Sync for the user setting, the user level. I'll show you where these settings come from in a very sort of brief demonstration in a short while. My sync last ran successfully on the 1st of the 1st, 0001. I think that was even before Project One, so I think we've perhaps got an issue there with my timestamp on that particular one. So that's the first change, to enable user sync, and I know some of you have already seen some of that going on. The second one, seeing messages saying that people aren't seeing the shared content. So I don't think anybody can confirm that they can actually see the PowerPoint slides that I'm sharing at the moment. Heather can. Doug can. Yep, sounds good. It seems like it's a mixed bag there, where some are seeing and some cannot. Looks like 50-50. We could take a poll on it. But if you can rejoin, as Heather suggested, then hopefully that will get the video working. Or we are recording this, so if you have missed some of the early slides, you should be able to catch those on the recording. The next screenshot I've got is actually on the connected SharePoint sites. This isn't live yet. You won't see this on your particular sites. But we've added a new option in connected SharePoint sites that says Settings in the heading. So this is a sort of a global setting. This isn't per site or per EPT or anything like that, but it just allows you to choose whether you automatically create a site on first publish, whether you allow people to choose, or whether you sort of do not create the sites at all. And then if you do create those, do you allow sort of the synchronization of tasks of those sites, and do you sync that sort of the project task to the task list, that kind of thing. So we're getting sort of really a lot more granular with how we allow the sites to be synchronized and the user permissions to be synchronized. So hopefully that should satisfy people who don't need sites, but also it should improve performance generally, because there's a lot of work going on doing this kind of synchronization, and it seems as if a lot of it may not be particularly needed or wanted by our customers. To a brief demonstration of those features, I'm just going to switch over to one of my other monitors, and I'll just leave it for a short while this loads up for everybody. This will probably take a little while to come through and be viewable by everybody, but it looks as though most people's screens are going blue in my participants window, which should mean that most of you can see this. I guess if you couldn't see the PowerPoint, you probably won't see this, but hopefully we're capturing this in the recording. So what you should be seeing there is the PWA settings for my particular, it's actually my TechEd 2014 site, and we've now got a new option down here under Security, Manage User Sync Settings. And if I go into that option, we'll see the settings that I showed you in the screenshot. So we can now go in and say, yes, I want to enable Project Web App Sync. Say I also want to enable Project Site Sync. And potentially you can then choose whether you want to enable Project Site Sync for SharePoint task list projects as well as sort of enterprise projects. So that it gives you a lot of flexibility over exactly how you sort of set things up there. The other one I showed you is under additional server settings on that same page, and that shows you where you can set the project professional version number. The one I've got in there is the August CU. That's a good one to choose, and that's the one I mentioned in my blog posting when I did this sort of introduction to this feature earlier on in August. The other couple of things I'm going to go back to the slides for they're things that we've actually announced through the Message Center. So if you haven't come across the Message Center, it gives you this alert at the top of the screen in your Office 365 ribbon. You can then go to the Message Center, and you can see things like changes coming to the Business Intelligence Center. We're making some changes to SharePoint Online. Allows you to sort of plan forward for those changes. So I'll jump back to the PowerPoints, and we can go back to that the PowerPoint session. So I had a question just before I go on to the next one from Doug. It's unclear whether the two different project site sync choice boxes are. So just bear with me a second. So I think, Doug, you're asking about the project web app sync and the project site sync. The project web app sync is whether you synchronize permissions for PWA itself, so the home site. The enable project site sync is the one that you would use if you're looking at the sites themselves, so whether you want to sync permissions to sites. I'm just bringing that screen up again, and what might help to sort of make it clear, if I take you to a queue history job. So here you're seeing my browser from earlier this morning, and I created a project called Webcast 1. I had both settings on, so I had two jobs fired. I had the synchronized project web app permission to project site, so that's basically setting the permissions on my Webcast 1 site for people who were in the project. So I'd added a couple of users to the project. I published. That put all the information over to the site Webcast 1. The other job was the synchronized project web app permissions to project web app. So that basically is making sure that anybody who has particular roles within PWA is given access to the PWA site. So that's the project web app rather than the site for the project, in this case my PWA/Webcast 1 site. So hopefully that's made it a little bit clearer. Great question, Doug. I'll go back to the PowerPoints now. So the other two changes I wanted to mention before handing over to Adrian and going on with the hot fixes, the first one, the Business Intelligence Center, is going to be going away. That doesn't mean that you can't do everything that you could do before in terms of reporting in Project Online. It's just that we're not using that sort of location, the Business Intelligence Center, for making those changes. And again, this is sort of a couple of reasons that have led to this. One, we've certainly heard that a lot of our partners aren't particularly using the Business Intelligence Center. It doesn't really confer any great sort of benefits over using a normal folder or library for putting those sort of reports and documents into. So the other aspect was more at the back end, the creation of a PWA site and the provisioning of a PWA site in Project Online. We're finding that, again, a lot of the resources going into that creation were just for creating the Business Intelligence Center. And in terms of some of the failures we were seeing, and the higher proportion of failures were coming during the provisioning of the Business Intelligence Center rather than PWA itself. So we did a sort of bit of a rethink on how we do that. And that particular article will give you details of what's going to happen to the BI Center. And you can get to that from your Message Center as well. And that will enable you to sort of find out what you need to do. We're not changing anything within your existing sites. You will still have the Business Intelligence Center if you've got it today. That document will help you choose how you move forward and whether you want to carry on using the Business Intelligence Center or whether you want to use our sort of new folders. Any new PWA sites won't get the BI Center at all. So that article should give you a lot more information to answer any questions you have on that particular topic. The next one, and this is a notice of deprecation of features, and again, this is on your message board on your Office 365 portal. But basically, we announced a few days ago, on the 4th of September, that we're going to be removing the links for the My Task functionality and the Outlook Sync functionality. So the My Tasks is where it would aggregate all of your tasks in one place from your personal site, for instance, tasks from your projects, tasks that were synchronized from Outlook, could all be brought together into one place. The other part of that feature was the synchronization to Outlook. So on any SharePoint list, you could say whether you wanted those tasks synced across to your Outlook tasks. Now, both of those features are going away. They're not actually going away for a year. They will carry on working from a year from the 4th of September 2014. But what we are doing is removing the links for those. And again, the KB article there gives you a little bit more information, and you can certainly carry on using those for the remainder of the year that they will be available. We're simply removing the lists really as a way of sort of discouraging further use of those features. And we don't want people to start using those features now and then find that they go away, and perhaps they didn't, they joined after this event, after this message, and hadn't realized they were going away. So the idea of removing the links is really to sort of discourage the use because the feature is going away. Again, that came down to a few different reasons behind that. Some of that was around performance and supportability, those kind of things. It's just a feature that we didn't think had was really delivering what we wanted it to deliver to customers on those particular areas. So if you've really loved those features, I'm sorry that they're going away, but certainly that KB will give you a little bit more information there. So on to Adrian, and he's going to be talking about Project and Project Server 2013 cumulative updates, starting with the one that is due out later today, the September CU, and also talking about some of the more recent ones in August and July. So thank you very much, and over to you, Adrian.
Thank you, Brian. Great updates on the Project Online and everything that's happening there. So, as Brian mentioned here, I'm going to be talking about the September, which should happen either today or close today, if it doesn't happen exactly today, for those updates, the August and the July cumulative updates. So you've probably noticed that's 3 months in a row. Is that a trend? Is that something that we've changed? Because in the past we only did cumulative updates every other month. It is a new thing that we will now be able to ship cumulative updates each month, and so it's a great thing for you. Could also mean more planning, I suppose, because if you have fixes that are coming every month, then you would have to say, well, we're going to plan on maybe installing the October cumulative updates, and we're just going to have to skip over September or whatever, even though there may be a fix there that we need. So more planning, but there's more opportunity also to get the fixes that you need quicker. Okay, so let me start off with the September cumulative update. I have the server knowledge base article listed there. If you go there right now, you probably won't find it. It'll say that you've hit a knowledge base article that doesn't exist or has been removed, but it will go live probably later today. The first item here is that if you have resource plans and you're manipulating them in PWA, which is the only place that you can do that, and you're using Internet Explorer 10 or 11, when you close out of that resource plan, it doesn't actually check it back in. Therefore, if someone else were to go and try to manipulate that resource plan, it would say, hey, this is already checked out to Brian, and you'd say, why? What's Brian doing that's leaving this checked out? Well, there were some changes made in Internet Explorer along the way that made it so that our asynchronous call to check that in was not happening. And so we've made some adjustments to make it happen. Now, it's interesting to note here too that if you use Chrome or Firefox or the other supported browsers, they were actually working fine. So this is a case where Internet Explorer was not working properly. So we made some adjustments so that'll work properly now. The next item is users removed from Active Directory are not inactive in Project Server. In previous versions of Project Server, if I'm synchronizing users, either a resource pool or groups to Active Directory, if that person is then inactivated in Active Directory or even removed, what it should do is go out and inactivate them in Project Server. So it just set their account to inactive, and that way it's still there for reporting purposes. It makes it so that you can't assign that person to new work within projects and so forth. And so that's what happened in the past. Well, when we went to the online environment, there were some good reasons to not inactivate users when the synchronization was occurring, but we found out that that's not necessarily a great idea for the on-premises environments, because you really need that functionality to prevent new work being assigned to people who are no longer available and so forth. So we've re-implemented that functionality. This third one here, we like to affectionately call the squiggly red line problem. Just to back up a little bit, in Project Server 2013, all accounts are claims-based. And so when you create a new account or a new resource that's going to log onto the server and so forth, the account information will have things like I: with £W and lots of other little funny characters, then a pipe symbol, and then like the user's account, like server slash or domain slash username. So if you happen to have multiple identity providers installed, so maybe you have something that is going to, it could be going to something out on the internet, and another one that's maybe your local claims provider or whatever. What was happening is if you happen to have the same named user, then every time you went to the page where you edit a user or edit a resource, it would come up with a little squiggly line. If you hovered over it, it would say, there are multiple entries, you need to match something. It's like, well, I did that the last time I was on this page. Why can't it remember that this is the person that I really want? Well, the problem here is that we weren't saving the full path information to the identity provider that provided that particular account. Therefore, every time you opened up the page, it would say, Brian Smith. Go out to all the identity providers, and we'd have a couple that would say, yep, I know Brian Smith. And so then the page was saying, you need to select a user here. Well, we've made the adjustment so that that now works properly. For this to work fully properly, do note that there was a fixed shift in SharePoint in the July cumulative update that you need to also install. I don't have that number here for you for that KB article, but just keep that in mind. The fourth item here is that auto approvals and auto publishes can cause site creation to fail. And you're thinking, well, why would this happen? Well, consider this example. When a project manager publishes a project, there is the option that makes it so that they can choose whether or not a site gets created. If that option is turned on and the project manager has that capability, what was happening is this. Let's suppose that I, as the project manager, I assign Brian a task. Brian gets it, and in either single entry mode, timesheets, and or on my task, Brian enters some actual work and then submits that for approval. Well, as soon as he does the submission, it will then get auto-approved and then auto-published. What would happen is that the server would say, oh, gosh, I need to go create a site for this thing. Of course, there's no one there to say whether or not a site should get created because it's all happening on the server. And so it would attempt to create a site on Brian's behalf, and of course it would fail because first off, Brian doesn't have permissions to be creating sites, and second, it really should be asking me if I want to create a site. And so you might think, well, okay, so what? It failed. What it was doing, however, it was kind of plugging up the queue with just all these failed messages. And if you have a lot of these publishes that are happening all the time, it was just a lot of noise there. And it wasn't blocking anything, but it was just a lot of noise that didn't need to be there. So we've resolved that problem. The last item on this page is that if you're in single entry mode, and if the default My Work view for timesheets is deleted, then you can't create new timesheets. In previous versions of Project, when you would go to a page in PWA, if you'd never been there before, we would always give you a view to look at. So the unique thing about going into single entry mode is that it says, well, I need to make sure that I have two things. I need to make sure that there is a timesheet view and that there is a My Work view. Well, unfortunately, we allowed you to delete the My Work view, and once you did that, there was no way to create new timesheets. So that's obviously a very bad thing, unless if you don't want your people to create timesheets. So we've now corrected that problem. On to the next page here. Updating project level enterprise resources via the PSI invalidates the results of some formula fields. Okay, sounds interesting. What's really unique about this is that in order to run into this problem, you had to have updated and upgraded all the way from Project Server 2003. And when you had 2003, you had to have defined certain enterprise custom project fields. So all of those things combined, what would happen here is that you would update through PSI. You would say, okay, I want to update this project, and it would go out and the code that's supposed to be calculating all this stuff, and that would go out and it would say, what is this field? I don't even recognize it because it's way back from 2003. And so the server was not properly recognizing those built-in enterprise custom fields from 2003 that are still valid today. They should still work, and so it was just not working with them properly. And so if I happen to have a formula that was set up, it would end up just not calculating. And so if it, let's say the answer was 5 days, it would end up calculating nothing, and you would end up with a blank. Now the next item here, timesheet approvals, history page, custom date range doesn't filter properly. If your date format is day, month, year, like it is in most of the world, outside of the United States, then when you went to this page and you tried to apply a filter that was supposed to be using a date range, it would not do it correctly. Essentially, it was getting mixed up between month, day, year versus day, month, year. So you could end up with, let's say, if January 9th would end up being September 1st and so forth, and so you just wouldn't get what you expected. So we've adjusted and fixed that problem. The third item here is the published information in that given table I have listed there, the timesheet resources table within the reporting database is wrong. Okay, why is it wrong? Well, when you submit and let's say you get your timesheet approved, there is information put into this table that says who you are and that your timesheet was approved. Likewise, when you submit status and it gets approved within approval, status approval, there's also a line that gets written to this table. Now, it should be going through the table and saying, well, Brian Smith, I know who Brian Smith is, same guy, I don't need to write anything here. But what was happening is that when it did the status approval, it was using the claims account information. So that looks a whole lot different from Brian Smith. And so you were getting two lines in the table for those two different approvals. And so if you are trying to create a report that says, find me all of the approvals done for Brian Smith, you wouldn't necessarily get what you would expect, simply because you're not using all the right strings to try to find Brian. So we've now adjusted it so that it puts it in based on Brian's name and not his claims account. So you'll get one record and it'll all look really well and work well for you. The fourth item here, project level custom fields don't calculate as expected when updated from a PDP. Suppose you have two enterprise custom fields, and let's say they're cost fields. And then also, let's suppose that you have a third field, which is a formula that relies on those two cost fields. You go to a PDP or project detail page, and this could be a part of a workflow, for example. You go there, you fill in the information for those two cost fields. And so maybe the one says, tell me what you think the cost for whatever is supposed to be. And the other one, you enter in that cost. Well, when you save that project detail page, you would expect it to go out and calculate the cost in that formula. It was not always occurring. In fact, it may not occur until you actually went to the next PDP or did some other things, came back to the PDP to calculate and so forth. It wasn't happening on the first try, essentially. And so we've now fixed that problem. Now, the last item here, the reporting project publish job can fail with that foreign key constraint error there. This has been, unfortunately, a very common problem, and it occurs with baseline data, and it occurs if you have more than one baseline set, and it occurs depending on when the baselines were set in relationship to each other, and lots of things all together bring this problem out. Now, we actually shipped a fix for this in the July cumulative update. However, right before the fix went onto the street, we found out that it really wasn't fixing as much as we had hoped that it would fix. But it was too late to actually pull it from the July CU. It wasn't actually harming anything, but it also wasn't fixing everything that we had expected it to do. So we stepped back and we said, all right, we need to go back and we need to look at something that's going to be a little bit more inclusive here, holistic. And so usually hot fixes are supposed to be the least invasive, least risky thing that we can do to fix the problem. Well, in this case here, we had to step back and take something that was a little bit more invasive, a little bit more risky, but get the job done. So we've done that. Now, the good news is that I've talked to a lot of customers and who have used a private release that I've given them to test this out with, and every one of them has reported back that it has solved the problem. So cross our fingers, it is now solved for good here in the September cumulative update. Okay, on to the client. Since the early days of project, one of the things that you've been able to do with views, tables, filters, groupings, and things of that nature is that you've been able to have a little checkbox. Well, there's a little checkbox that specifies whether or not you want that particular element to exist within the menu or in, as in the case of 2010 and 2013, within the ribbon. Okay? The problem here is that if you're connected to a project server, that checkbox was ignored completely, which means that if I had defined 40 different views in the enterprise, that I was going to see all 40 of those within the drop-down list for views within Project Professional. And that, well, that was just causing lots of confusion for people because there are many things that you may not want your users to use on a daily basis. As an example, let's suppose you've created an interactive filter. That filter probably is going to be used specifically with a given table and view, but you probably don't want your users to use that interactive filter on other views and tables and so forth, because it just wouldn't make sense in that context. And so what you would do when you define that as part of the enterprise, you would say, I don't want to show this. So you would deselect that checkbox, and then you would expect that when a user starts project and then looks at a list of all of the available filters, that they would not see that interactive filter. So now we've corrected the problem, and that setting works properly, and you will see or not see the things that you specify. The second item here is that, and this is a regression from the April cumulative update, is that when you start Project Professional, if you're the user doing that, and if you do not have the open project template permission, project will crash. You won't even get past home base there. You won't get to first base. It's just going to crash before you get to do anything. So the workaround obviously in the meantime was, well, you're going to have to grant people that permission. But we fixed that problem so that the crash no longer occurs. Third item here, scalar work value set to 0 when an enterprise resource is assigned to a task. Consider this scenario. You create a task and you want to front load it with work. So you don't know who's going to be working on it right now, but you know exactly how much work you want to do. So later on, you assign a resource to the task, and what you find out is that the work on that is set to 0. But what's really interesting about this is that in the time scale, you may have set this task to be a 1 week long, and you may have 5 days of work, and so for every day you have 8 hours for a total of 40. it'll show the 8 hours on each of those 5 days on the right-hand pane, let's say in a task usage view, but on the left-hand side in the scalar value, it will show 0. So obviously that's a problem there because the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing and so forth, and so we've now adjusted and fixed that problem. The last item here on this page is that if you choose to print notes, and this is a page setup option available for sheet type views within Project Professional and Project Standard, it doesn't print the last line of your note. So within the notes dialog, or within, let's say, the task information dialog box, there's the notes tab, and there you can enter in some rich text. So you can put in bullet points and other things, just to say what you're doing with the task and so forth. Well, it would not print the last line, so that could be a problem if the last line told you exactly what you needed to know about that task. So obviously, if you leave off the last line of your novel, you may not know what the ending was. So we've now fixed that so that it prints the full note when you choose that option. Okay, so let's move on to the August cumulative update. For the server, and there's the KV article. Of course, this is live. You can go download this today. First item is that, well, let me just, for the first 3 items here, there's a theme here, the Project Calculation Service. The Project Calculation Service is the new server calculation engine that does things like edits. When you edit your project in PWA, it's what's used so that you can do that editing. It is used when you apply your updates to your projects from status updates and so forth. It's used for those sorts of things. Now, Project Calculation Service being new, unfortunately, has a few little teething pains, and so we're on the path of fixing those here. The first problem here was that the updates applied to a project didn't always appear in the project. Well, why didn't this occur? Well, in this particular case, it was because the Project Calculation Service was looking at some resource information saying, this doesn't make sense right now. Well, normally within Project Professional, which the Project Calculation Service is based on, it wouldn't have made sense and it would know how to ignore it. But in this case, it was saying, well, I really don't know what to do with that piece of information on that resource. I guess I'll do nothing. So it would just give up and the update wouldn't get applied to the project. The second item here is editing large projects could cause the updates to fail. In this particular case, we were hitting some timeouts on all of the different communications that were going back and forth between the calculation service. There's a manager that manages all that stuff, and then there's the service, and then there's the node which does all the calculations itself. It sends back the answers to the calculation manager, which then sends it off to do some other things on the server. So there's a lot of moving pieces here, and so there were some timeouts that were being hit, and therefore it just failed. The third item here says that if the calculation service fails for any reason at all, then when applying updates, it would say within PWA that the updates had been applied successfully, even though they had not. Well, this was a case, again, where the right hand wasn't communicating with the left hand, so the PCS was failing, and the statusing system was just assuming that everything was going to work correctly, and so it said, well, I did my job, and it wasn't checking with the PCS to see if it really did its job or not. So therefore, it would say, yep, updates all applied, we're all good. Of course, you would look at the project and you would say, where is the update from Brian? I know I applied it. It says right here I did it successfully. Why isn't it there? Well, here the Project Calculation Service was failing for one of those 2 problems above, or a number of different issues which we've fixed as a part of the June cumulative update and so forth. And so it just wasn't registering the fact. So now it will register the fact that, hey, a failure has occurred. Now, just to let you know, after we shipped the August cumulative update, we had some customers who told us, well, I've installed all this stuff and it's still not working properly for me. How come? Well, so we started looking at this more carefully again, and like we did with some other things here, we decided to take a more holistic approach to this, to say, well, let's do the more invasive, more risky fix, but make sure that we get it right so that we don't have to keep on having yet another person say, well, I installed your update, but it didn't work. because there's yet another thing that we didn't quite find, and it didn't, the PCS is failing because of that. So we've now gone through and we've created another fix, which we are shipping in the October cumulative update. So keep that in mind. But we find for most customers that what we've shipped here in the August cumulative update does work properly. The last item here on this page is general unhandled exception, and then it gives the whole read status approval for project for grid JSON. So what was happening here is, consider you go to the approvals page, you get there and you see a bunch of things that you probably need to approve, and so you say to yourself, well, what I'd really like to do is look at remaining work, and I'd like to sort it by remaining work. So the remaining work that's highest or lowest or whatever, I want to put that either at the top or the bottom. So you do that. It all works great. Well, the next time you come back to the view, it doesn't work so great at all. And the problem is that the remaining work in the view itself is a integer value or long integer. So it's a number. However, what was happening here is that when it was trying to read that information and then sort it, it was trying to sort it based on a text value. Well, it's not text, and so it was failing, and therefore you couldn't get into the page to view your approvals. But we had some workarounds for people who had hit this in the on-premises environment, and that really involved going in and whacking out some records within the database. But that didn't help a whole lot for our online customers. So now the problem is resolved. Moving on, more server fixes. There was an issue that if you added some updates, depending on how you added them within your timesheet, that when you submitted the status update, that you got this error that said error communicating with the server. So we've fixed that problem. The next item is exception occurred in method, and it gives the big huge long method here. The important part is it says cannot cast db null value to type system.byte. Now that may mean little or nothing to you, and you may be saying, I don't even want to hear that. What's the problem here? Well, the issue is that we were obviously doing some things wrong. There are some database enumeration values that say whether or not something has been submitted, what is the state of the submission, and so forth. What we didn't take into account is that in some cases that particular field can have a null value. So instead of having a value, let's say 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, it could just be totally blank. And so in this case here, it was running across one of those cases where it was null versus having a specific value, and it didn't know how to handle that because it was saying, well, let me take this nothing and turn it into a number. Well, nothing doesn't turn into numbers very well, and so we got the error. We've corrected that problem. The next third item here is updating percent complete through the PSI may reset assignment units on assignments set to 0%. What does that mean? Suppose I have a task, and on it I have two assignments. One where I've set the assignment units to 0%, meaning they're assigned to the task, but they're not going to be doing any work. And on another assignment on that task, they do have a valid percent complete. Maybe it's 100%, 50%, doesn't matter. The point is I have two assignments. One is at 0, and the other one is greater than at 0. If I update through the PSI that particular task, then what happens is the assignment that was set at 0% doesn't remain at 0%, which is wrong because obviously I don't want that person to have any work. The fourth item here is duplicate rows in the hired resources report. So this is a report that you can look at if you're looking at the portfolio analysis details within Project Server. This is a fix that we did within 2010, and we've basically taken that fix and rolled it over here into 2013. But the basic problem was that if you have a resource with more than one cost rate, then you would get duplicate rows within this report. And it just, well, it didn't read very well. The last item here is user synchronization doesn't complete properly. This is a very important one. We had a number of customers where they would say, hey, users are getting locked out of the project sites. Why is this? Well, we would look and would find that the synchronization jobs were failing. And in looking at it more carefully, we found that a number of different things were happening. Some of it was that we were seeing deadlocks within the SharePoint code that does the update into the SharePoint, updating the user accounts there. And so we made a bunch of changes and made some index changes and so forth to make that run properly. So we shipped a fix actually in the July cumulative update, but we found that we still have some problems here still occurring. So we looked at it further, and we found that when we were putting users into the SharePoint sites, we put them into a group, but we also found that in some cases we say, you know, it would be quicker for us to start over here. Instead of going through user by user by user and adding or removing them from the group, let's go ahead and just kind of recreate everything. So what we would do is delete the entire security group and then add the users back to it. Well, we found out that deleting a security group is actually very costly. And so what we do now is we simply leave the group there, remove the users from it, and then add back those who should be as a part of that group with the proper permissions for them. And so it now works much more efficiently, and we don't run into these problems where the user synchronization jobs fail. On the client side, the first two items here is that Project Professional or Project Standard even could crash when doing certain things. The first one was when entering work on the resource usage view or in a usage view such as resource usage, it could crash. This was more apparent if you happen to be in a master project. So within a master project, you have the sub-projects. You say, okay, on sub-project ABC, I want to go in and I want to change the work for a given resource. Well, you would try to do that and it could crash. On the second one here, you were simply adding some actual work and then the crash would occur. In this particular case, it was occurring when you had the options enabled that say that you want to reschedule the incompleted work to the status date, that sort of thing turned on. It was crashing as a part of that actual work entry. So we've fixed those two crashes. Third item here, you want to group your view and you're grouping on costs and things of that nature. So you have baseline cost, and on that grouping row, you would love to have that rolled up as well. Unfortunately, for cost resources, which they're all about cost, it was not doing any of the roll-ups for the baseline costs associated with those cost resources. So we've now fixed that. Fourth item here, inactive tasks don't schedule properly when created from a template in PWA. So consider this. You want to have a task within your template. Maybe you set it to 20 days and you also set it to be inactive. Now, the person who creates the project, they're in PWA, they do so, all looks good. They open up the project in Project Professional and they look at that given task and they make it active. Instead of being a 20-day task, it's a one-day task. In fact, it didn't matter what you set the duration to, it was always going to be a one-day task. So we've now corrected that so the duration will be what it is, what it was when you created that template. The last item here, saving a project with a new name could change the actual time-phased work. When we save a project or you do a save as to a new project, there's lots of code that comes into play here because we copy over a lot of things. And in this particular case, we were looking at the time phase data, and we needed to also look at the calendar behind that time phase data, because in order to make sure that the actual work gets scheduled, and that may sound a little bit funny, scheduling actual work, but to make sure that the actual work gets put into the place where it needs to be, there is a calendar exception behind that. It's a hidden exception, but it's still there nonetheless. Well, what was happening during the save as, the calendar exception was not being pulled into the equation soon enough, and therefore the actual work would get rescheduled according to what the current calendar was. And so if you said Tuesday was not working and the actual work was supposed to be on Wednesday or whatever the case may be, or I should say more appropriately, Tuesday is a non-working day, but yet you had actual work on Tuesday because that's where you actually did it, then when you open up the project, that actual work could have been moved to Wednesday. So we've now made that adjustment so that that works properly. Moving on, if you use VBA user forms and you put specific controls onto them, project could crash at different points. Now, it wouldn't necessarily crash immediately. It could be while you're using the form. It could be while you're trying to close the project. It would just crash at some point. The next one is that the new reporting within Project 2013 allows you to do a lot of formatting. You put text boxes onto the page or whatever you want. And if you're using the input method editor or the IME, which allows you to put in things like Asian characters and things like that, what was happening is that it was duplicating the character. So think of this in English. If I put the word the, T-H-E, it was ending up with T-T-H-H-E-E. So everything was duplicated, which didn't read very well. Third item here, data entered into the enterprise project field is not read by project. Well, I talked about in the September cumulative update how if you've upgraded all the way from 2003 into 2013, that you would run into that problem. Same exact problem here, except it's in the client. So if you have an enterprise project duration field, and if that had been defined as a part of the 2003 server, then when you open up project and you go into that field, and let's say the value is set to 0 and you want it to be 5, you would enter it, you save your project, and then you would open it up again. It would still be there for you, but anyone else who opened up your project, it would not be there. The problem was it wasn't making it past your cache into the server. So it just wasn't even going to the server at all. So we've now fixed that problem. The fourth item here is enterprise custom field values lost when inserted subproject is not linked to the source project. So when you create a master project, typically you insert a subproject and that maintains a link to the source project. So the real data is coming live from that other project. But there's also an option here that you can say, well, I just really want to consolidate all this information from these subprojects into a big, huge project. And so to do that, you insert the project, but you clear the little checkbox that says that you want to maintain the link. In doing that, it was copying over all of the information except for the enterprise custom field data. So that now works properly. The last one here is the duration format can be incorrect, and then that can cause time phase data within the reporting database to be incorrect. So a duration within a task or any other place that you see it is actually two different pieces. You have the number which represents the base number of minutes that make up that duration, and then you have the units, which are things like minutes, hours, days, weeks, and so forth. Well, there were a few cases where the duration format just wasn't there, and normally that should be handled properly, but when it was taking that information and putting that time phase data into the reporting database, it was getting very confused without that format information, and so it was doing it incorrectly. Finally, these two items here are with regards to protected actual work. So this is a server feature that makes it so that a project professional user can't change the actual work that's been entered by a team member. We rewrote this feature in 2013 in order to get rid of some problems that we just weren't ever able to totally fix in the previous versions. And in doing so, we have a few teething pains here. So the concept is great, but the execution wasn't perfect. So one of the items here was that you couldn't change the physical percent complete. Well, physical percent complete is never tied to the progress that an assignment gives to the project manager to apply to the project. So therefore, it should never be blocked. Well, it was blocked and now it's unblocked again. The next one is that you couldn't change the time phased remaining work when protected actual work was enabled. So as a project manager, you can't change the actual time phased work that's been reported, but you should be able to go in and change the remaining work. Unfortunately, that was also being blocked. There were a number of other things that were not working properly. For example, there were some conditions under which the project manager could actually accidentally change actual work by dragging around Gantt bar pieces and things of that nature. So we put a whole bunch of fixes into this particular cumulative update, although we only had 2 active bugs that were tracking it, which are identified right here. But just know that there are a whole bunch of fixes that were done. Now moving on to July, this was actually a fairly small release, and this was the first monthly release that we went to. So after the June cumulative update, then we started with the monthly releases. The first one is that if you have baseline or negative baseline cost, then it wasn't stored in the reporting database correctly. In fact, it was always being stored as 0. So that was obviously not correct. The next item is adding a task to a filtered timesheet view caused an error, loading error. Okay, so you went into your timesheet and you said, there's another task I would like to add here. And so you would do that. You would choose the task from the list and you would do so. That would actually cause an error, which was obviously a bad thing. And so we've adjusted that problem. Finally, there were a bunch of conditions under which your SharePoint task list, which you can modify there, and you can also synchronize to Project Professional, so you can edit it there and look at the task list and so forth. There were a lot of things that were happening that were basically within Project Professional. It was basically saying that anytime you opened it up, that just about everything had changed, and therefore it was sending off a bunch of unneeded notifications, and you were getting lots of alerts that you never should have seen, and so we've now corrected those problems. On the client side, this first one right here is a regression from, I believe, a fix we did in the April cumulative update. So let's suppose that you've set a baseline in your project. So for the baseline, you look at the time phase baseline values, and maybe on a Tuesday you see 8 hours of work, and then maybe on a Wednesday you see 7 hours of work. Okay. Later on, you decide to set a new baseline, so you set baseline 1. And maybe those values are totally different. Maybe they don't even exist. Unfortunately, when you viewed those values within PWA for baseline 0, for baseline 1, baseline 2, baseline 3, baseline 4, all the way through baseline 10, they would all show the exact same numbers. What was happening here is that there's a setting that allows you to choose which baseline earned values are calculated from. That setting was controlling what was being viewed within the usage views. So if it was set that you wanted your earned value to be set based on maybe baseline 3, then all of the baseline 0 through 10 would show baseline 3. So the great thing about this, or if there's any silver lining in this whole thing, is that no data was lost, no data was corrupted. It was just a view problem. So now you see the right things. The last item, or the second item here, I shouldn't say the last item, the second item, we shipped a fix in the June cumulative update for the server. So the symptom would be you would save your project, and then suddenly there would be an error on the server, and basically your project save would be rolled back. You would see an error in the client. It would say 9,000 error. You go to it and it would say there would be absolutely no information there to help you understand what the problem was or why it even occurred. We shipped that fix in the June cumulative update for the server, so that the server would not just reject the entire save process, but would still save the project. But we knew that there was still some corruption happening here that had been causing the server save to fail. Well, we finally found it, and what we found is that there were some conditions under which it would corrupt the lookup tables on local fields. And once that occurred, of course, then that was causing the downstream save to the server to fail. Well, we've now corrected the core problem that was causing the corruption to occur. Now, the last item here is that if you're into VBA and programming, it could be through Visual C, Visual VB or whatever, there's the project before assignment change event. And let's suppose that I'm creating a brand new assignment, so I've just assigned a resource to a task. Well, the assignment index was always returning -1, and that's bad simply because -1 doesn't tell me anything. It doesn't allow me to take that value and then refer to that assignment which has then just been created. So it's not until after the fact, until the assignment has actually been created, that I would have to somehow invoke new code to go figure out what it was that I just was going to create. So we fixed that problem. This was a regression from 2010 and from previous versions, so that issue has now been resolved. So that's it for the cumulative update. A lot of changes. As with all of the cumulative updates, look at them and decide if they are things that you should be installing into your system. If you don't need them, then maybe you'll want to wait until a later cumulative update, or maybe wait for a service pack or whatever the case may be. But in all cases, if you go to deploy your cumulative updates, do make sure that you test in a testing environment. Go through your normal types of tests that you would go through, that your users do on a daily basis, to make sure that things still work as you expect. We try to do our best to make sure we don't have regressions in what we do. Sometimes we make mistakes and we introduce new behaviors that we had never thought of before. So that's my advice on that. Looks like we're about done now, so Brian?
I think we're at the top of the hour already. Thanks very much for that very thorough overview of the hot fixes. I certainly learned a lot, so hopefully everybody learned a lot too. I know Heather's got some questions that she wants to ask about how the meeting went. I've got one last slide. Before that, December the 16th, we should be talking about changes from the cumulative update releases of October, November, and December, and any other sort of Project Online changes that happen between then and now. And we'll also be working on several Microsoft Virtual Academy sessions between then and now as well. We sort of run out of time for questions, but I'll be certainly hanging around in the chat window if anybody wants to post them.